My name is Anriette Esterhuysen. I'm from South Africa and I work from South Africa. But I work for an international network and NGO that's virtual, that has 50 members around the world, and staff, about 30 staff members that all work in different parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. So in your opening, in the speech at the opening panel, you expressed some criticism about the ICT4D field. Could you repeat that once more and clarify what you meant?
Part of my criticism comes from APC's history, which is APC was established in 1990, and it's a network that believes that you can use ICTs for social justice and for development, and we see the two very linked. And therefore we think that you cannot apply technology for development if you don't also analyze and try and act on the social and political context in which those ICT tools are being used for development. And we've always felt that in ICT4D there's a tendency, it's not universal, but there is a tendency to focus very much on the technology, on people becoming consumers of technology rather than owners and creators of new technologies. And we think, part of our critique is in that sort of technocratic, a little bit of an apolitical approach in ICT4D, but it's not universal. And then the other point I made in the opening panel, because I was asked to reflect specifically on how can research be more useful to practitioners. And I think I made a few points, but just to highlight some of them. There really is still a tendency for research to be an extractive industry in the ICT4D sector. There's a certain interest in it, and it's considered quite exciting. So you have many postgraduate students and also professional commissioned researchers going to developing countries and interviewing practitioners, taking that knowledge, taking it back to the north, and the north can even be in your own country. There can be a north, and then the knowledge is packaged there, and it's addressed to audiences within the academic community, and the learning is not fed back to the people that are actually doing the work, and it goes even full circle, because the research questions are also not defined by the practitioners. The research questions are defined within the academe or within the donor community. Or the development sector, the bilateral. And it just doesn't really get to, I think useful knowledge is built, but it doesn't get packaged or shared in a form that is useful to the people that are giving the raw material, the experiences.
And what is your organization doing to overcome this gap?
We try to do research that is quite localized. We do quite a lot of policy advocacy research, and we feel that the research has to be linked to capacity building. So the people that are doing the research need to find that an experience where they can actually learn more about a particular issue or their work. And then we also believe the research should be done in such a way and shared in such a way that it can influence policymakers and create more awareness. So we've developed a kind of a methodology where we do research, for example, on something like spectrum. We're doing research at the moment on how spectrum is allocated in a few developing countries, and this would be wireless spectrum as well as a broadcast spectrum. And we have the research, for example, the Kenya report is now in. The research was done by a Kenyan researcher who's based in Kenya, and he's now worked with a journalist on our team to turn that into a story. We call them the spectrum stories, because spectrum is like something that people don't really understand. So now there's a spectrum story that tries to explain to people how it affects, how the lack of openness about how spectrum is allocated affects small businesses, for example. And as part of this project, we've also done a little issue paper, a short briefing, 10 pages, that explains what spectrum is and spectrum regulation. And then what we do to try and get this to policymakers is we try and identify events, meetings, sometimes there are UN meetings, sometimes there are local meetings, where we can then present this information to governments or find other forums where we can actually then present this information in a way where policymakers could become a little bit more aware. Sometimes there's a specific policy process, and then we'll try and interact with them in a very deliberate way around that policy process. We'll make submissions and we'll say, think about this, you've got to do this. But sometimes it's just building their awareness. I think that the change is incremental. I think that you don't always have huge, big, especially with advocacy, successes, but if you can build more awareness. I mean, I think as you are doing, we're building more awareness about ICT4D in your community.
So do you feel that your criticism, you just expressed that it is heard in the general ICT4D field, or?
I think it is heard, but I think it's understood. I think it's difficult for people to break out of that pattern. I think the academic structure, the structure of the academic system is not conducive towards ethical research, even though there's so much emphasis being placed on ethical research. There isn't, it's difficult because of the pressure, the discipline, and I think also what I have experienced with a lot of postgraduate students, for example, who would interview me or members of our team or our network, they do have good intentions about feeding back information for us, but it becomes, finishing a dissertation is a very pressurizing process, and at an emotional level, it becomes harder and harder. And I think often also they feel a little bit anxious about sending what they've written back to the people, that they access the information from. So at an emotional level, I think it sometimes slips off. So I do think something should be done to try and as part of the regime and the routine of doing postgraduate research, building mechanisms in like blogs, where researchers can blog their reflections as they write up their work. Maybe share, the idea of the story. Maybe every postgraduate student should, alongside the dissertation, which has its theoretical section and this and that, they should be required to write a little story about what they've learned from this process in plain language, which they can then share.
In our interviews with Tim Unwin and Dorothea Kleiner, it was like they stressed that this conference should bring together practitioners and researchers and bridge, and as you said, this criticism that technology is the silver bullet, that this conference should be different. Do you feel this reflected here?
Yes, I think yes. Yes and no, but I think mostly yes. I think what I find, and I've heard other people say this too, is that the format of the conference is fantastic. It's really been dynamic. The multiple formats, the fact that there are practitioners and researchers that are practitioners and practitioners that are researchers. Many of us have multiple identities. But there's been, I think, a kind of a split, because on the one hand between the workshops and the discussions and the networking and the papers. The papers are by and large not particularly interesting. So it seems to me that the people are very engaged and beginning to think of ICT4D in a much more nuanced and holistic, dynamic way. But the outputs don't seem to, most of the papers don't seem to be particularly rich.
Mm-hmm.
There were exceptions, of course.
Yeah. Yesterday we interviewed Paul Plattinger with African research done by
Yes,
Africans.
yeah.
Is that such an exception you were mentioning, or is that the right way to go?
I think that paper is interesting because I think it is a good paper, and I think it's very good that African researchers are looking at African research and where it's going and what impact it's having. So I think that's a fantastic initiative. What I'd like them to do is to apply a little bit more critical thinking as well. I haven't read the paper, but I had asked them a question about open access journals, and they quite correctly, Paul answered, that there's relatively more African research published in open access journals because open access journals have less strict criteria. And that's absolutely true. What I would like them to see, or to do, is to think, so what? What next? How do we change that? Does that matter? How can we try and achieve both more openness and more access, but not at the expense of quality? At some point, you do have to question the system, because there are real capacity constraints in Africa, and fewer writers, fewer people who can write material for high standard, and it's systemic. It goes down to primary school level. But you've got to begin to think also how you can change that. And I think in order to change that, you also need to try and analyze that. But I do think it's a very, very good initiative.
And now the next conference where it's going to happen was released. I'm not asking you about the place. It's been widely discussed.
I don't have a visa, I can tell you that much. I'll have to try and get one if I go.
But what would you like to see until then, in 1.5 years? What would you like to see that has changed in the meantime?
I would definitely like to see this format of an event continuing. For me, the richness of this event is practitioners and researchers and academics, who are not necessarily conducting research, but who have been exposed to lots of research, coming together in a learning environment. So for me personally, I'd like to have more of these sessions where one can take an issue and discuss it within a context of research knowledge and practice and practitioner knowledge, rather than just listen to papers. Now, I know that the listening to papers would need to be part of that. In terms of change, I think I'd like the ICT4D research community to focus really more on the social impacts and the social implications. But not only, I really think that there's a group of people here which are the technology design people and the human technology interface people, and I think they are also very important. So I think often it is the sum of these different types of knowledge coming together that can advance your understanding, rather than insisting that everyone works in a particular way. But I think a little bit more social impact, more innovation and creativity at the human technology interfacing and bringing them together. I think I'd like a little bit more policy. I found that there was very little research here on policy and the policy environment and the role of the public sector, in the ICT4D process. So, there's quite a lot of talk about governance, and I think that's important, and I really believe, and my network works in bottom-up governance and accountability. But the policy environment and the role of the state is still part of our reality, particularly in developing countries where we can't take it for granted. So I think I'd like perhaps a bit more focus on what's happening and what's not happening at that area to create enabling environments for innovation and ICT use for development and justice.
Okay. Any more questions?
Done.
Okay.
Thanks
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.